Have you ever wondered how people managed to keep their food fresh long before the advent of electricity? In medieval times, the convenience of popping leftovers into a refrigerator or ordering takeout when the pantry was bare was an unimaginable luxury. Instead, they had to be creative, often brilliantly so, though some of their methods were bizarre and a few were downright hilarious. Nowhere was this ingenuity more apparent than in medieval kitchens. These bustling, chaotic spaces were a far cry from our modern, sparkling clean ones. In place of refrigerators, you would find meats dangling from hooks, herbs hanging everywhere, and more salt than a pretzel factory. The kitchen was the heart of any medieval home, perpetually smoky, warm, and filled with a symphony of interesting smells, storing staples like preserved meats, dried vegetables, and mountains of bread. They accomplished all this without any of our modern must-haves. Imagine trying to explain ketchup to a medieval cook. Food storage began earnestly with the arrival of spring, as winter was a serious threat, and ordering a pizza when times got tough was certainly not an option. The cornerstone of this entire endeavor was salt, a substance so precious you might find it hard to believe its history. Roman soldiers were famously paid in salt, which is the very origin of our modern word salary. In medieval times, this value persisted, allowing clever Venetian traders to build immense fortunes simply by controlling the salt trade, making them the tech billionaires of their era, dealing not in smartphones, but in tiny white crystals. The salting process involved rubbing meat or fish with enormous quantities of salt, sometimes using up to 20% of the food's weight in salt alone. This caused the meat to shrivel up like a raisin in the sun, which was precisely the desired effect. The salt effectively transformed the food into a medieval version of beef jerky. A recipe from a 13th century kitchen even instructed to salt the meat until it looked as though it were covered in snow. This salting technique was incredibly versatile. Fish were packed into barrels between layers of salt, resembling a rather unappetizing lasagna. Pork was transformed into ham and bacon, and even vegetables were subjected to the treatment, with salted cabbage fermenting into sauerkraut. Interestingly, medieval doctors believed all this salt was beneficial for one's health, a notion that would surely give modern health experts a heart attack. However, relying on salt presented a significant problem. It was incredibly expensive. A single pound of salt could cost a common worker an entire week's wages. One notable story tells of a medieval French village that traded an entire flock of sheep just to acquire enough salt to survive the winter. When salt was too costly or scarce, medieval folks simply turned their kitchens into smokehouses. And I mean that quite literally. The entire room would be filled with so much smoke that a medieval cook stepping into a modern BBQ joint would likely feel perfectly at home, albeit without the fancy exhaust fans. This meant everyone probably smelled like smoked bacon around the clock, though it's doubtful anyone complained, as smelling like bacon was surely preferable to other common medieval aromas. The smoking process was ingenious. They would hang meat or fish high up in special chimneys or from the kitchen rafters, where the smoke from the cooking fires would slowly work its magic. The best woods for this purpose were oak, apple, and cherry, each imparting its own unique flavor. A medieval German cookbook even detailed specific wood pairings for different meats: oak for beef, apple for pork, and cherry for poultry. Archaeologists once discovered a perfectly preserved smokehouse from 1375 in London, and amazingly, the ceiling beams still carried the scent of smoke after more than 600 years. The smoke did more than just flavor the food. It created a protective all-natural barrier that repelled insects and bacteria, like a primitive food force field. This method wasn't limited to meat either. Cheese was smoked to extend its shelf life, a practice that gave rise to some of today's famous varieties like smoked Gouda. Even grains were smoked to prevent them from growing moldy, which must have resulted in some rather interesting tasting bread. Perhaps the most peculiar discovery was that they sometimes smoked eggs, a concept one can only imagine trying to explain to the chickens. The most affluent medieval households had separate, dedicated smokehouses with different levels for various foods. The top level was for light smoking of items like fish, the middle for medium smoking of pork, and the bottom, closest to the fire, was for heavy smoking of beef, a multi-level parking garage for dangling food. When smoking wasn't sufficient, medieval people turned to nature's freezer, employing snow and ice with remarkable creativity. Deep underground cellars served as the medieval equivalent of a refrigerator, except instead of an ice maker, servants were dispatched in winter to collect snow and ice as if on a frozen treasure hunt. The truly wealthy nobles constructed special buildings called ice houses, which were less like garden sheds and more like subterranean ice bunkers. The largest one ever discovered at Hampton Court Palace could hold an astonishing 75 tons of ice. These structures were built like upside-down ice cream cones, dug deep into the earth with incredibly thick walls. Some aristocrats even employed ice masters, whose sole duty was to prevent the ice from melting. These medieval ice houses worked so well, with sawdust packed between layers of ice as insulation, that some could keep ice frozen for up to 2 years. For those not wealthy enough to own a personal ice fortress, natural caves and stone cellars were a practical alternative. These spaces maintained a steady temperature of around 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, making them perfect for storing cheese, eggs, and vegetables. Some monasteries went so far as to build their own artificial caves, specifically for storing wine and beer, a clear indication of their priorities. One of the most amusing aspects of medieval cold storage was the practice of packing perishable food in snow during winter parties. A medieval party planner's list might include 3 barrels of wine, 2 roasted pigs, and enough snow to keep the fish from spoiling. They even served frozen desserts at grand feasts, which were essentially medieval snow cones flavored with honey or fruit juices. And yes, warnings akin to "don't eat the yellow snow" were sometimes issued, proving some jokes are truly timeless. But winter doesn't last forever, and eventually all that precious ice would melt. This is when medieval people shifted to their next strategy, drying everything in sight. And when I say everything, I mean everything that couldn't run away first. They turned food drying into an art form. Meat was transformed into jerky, grapes became raisins, and plums were turned into prunes. They would string up fruits and vegetables on long ropes, hanging them from their rafters like macabre Christmas decorations, making the entire house look like a perpetual food festival. They even constructed special drying towers, tall buildings with slatted open sides to allow airflow while keeping birds out. One famous tower in France could dry over 2,000 pounds of fruit at once. And some of these fruit castles still stand today, with archaeologists finding 500-year-old dried fruit bits in their corners. The ingenuity extended to the specific techniques used for different foods. Herbs were bundled and hung upside down, giving kitchens a rustic botanical-themed decor. Meat was sliced into incredibly thin strips, as no one wanted to risk a medieval stomachache from biting into a piece of half-dried beef. Another offered a quality test. If your dried beef bounces when dropped, you've done it right. If it shatters, you've created a weapon. Fish was also dried, often beaten flat until it was nearly paper thin. These dried fish were so hard that, according to one story, Norwegian sailors used them as plates. The greatest advantage of dried food was its light weight. A whole cow could be dried down to the size of a modern backpack, making it ideal for armies. Medieval armies even had an officer with the title Keeper of the Dry Stores. Sometimes, however, drying food wasn't enough, especially in damp or rainy climates. In these situations, medieval people turned to their secret weapon, vinegar and fermentation. The medieval world was obsessed with pickling. You couldn't step into a kitchen without encountering barrels of fermenting vegetables. Cabbage became sauerkraut, cucumbers turned into pickles, and even fish was fermented, with one German recipe simply stating to put it in vinegar until it stops smelling like fish and starts smelling like regret. The science they stumbled upon was brilliant. They discovered that good bacteria could combat the bad bacteria that causes spoilage and sickness. A single barrel of sauerkraut could sustain a family through winter while providing enough vitamin C to ward off scurvy. Indeed, medieval people were fighting pirate diseases before pirates were even considered cool. The world of fermentation had its dedicated masters. Some monasteries had entire rooms devoted to pickling, with monks keeping detailed records of their experiments. Records from one French monastery show they pickled over 15,000 eggs in a single year. But the true champions of fermentation were the Vikings, who created lutefisk, a dish of fermented fish soaked in lye until it achieved a jelly-like consistency, which they considered a delicacy. These fermented foods improved with age, and some noble families passed down barrels of pickled vegetables through generations as family heirlooms. Fermented concoctions were also used as medicine, with doctors prescribing them for everything from the common cold to broken bones. When all you have is a barrel of pickles, every ailment begins to look like a pickling problem. For preserving something truly special that needed to last for years, there was an even sweeter solution: honey. The incredible thing about honey is that it never spoils. Scientists have found 3,000-year-old honey in Egyptian tombs that was still perfectly edible. Medieval people were well aware of this superpower and used it for almost everything. They would pour it over fruits, meats, and even entire birds. One recipe suggests preserving a whole peacock in honey, as apparently chicken wasn't ostentatious enough. Beekeepers were treated like rock stars with special legal protections. They used honey extensively in medicine, applying it to cuts and prescribing it for insomnia. Some castles even had dedicated honey rooms, warm, dry spaces for storage where the walls would become sticky with drips, trapping insects like medieval flypaper. Finally, when you wanted to preserve something and make it more entertaining at the same time, there was alcohol. Medieval people discovered that wine and beer were not just for festive indulgence, but were also amazing food preservatives. Fruits, vegetables, and even eggs could last for months when soaked in alcohol. One French castle consumed over 100,000 liters of wine annually, with only half of it intended for drinking. The rest was used to preserve everything from cherries to whole geese. The most popular treats were drunken fruits, which were plums, cherries, and peaches soaked in spiced wine until they became boozy little flavor bombs. They even preserved eggs in alcohol, cracking them into barrels of wine or beer where they would pickle. These boozy eggs were served as bar snacks, and it was discovered that stronger alcohol worked better for preservation, leading to some very enthusiastic research into distillation. From simple salt to fancy wine, these were the ways medieval people kept their food edible. So next time you open your fridge, spare a thought for your ancestors. though perhaps you can skip their recipe for wine-soaked eggs.